I too want to thank Jay and the department. This is a great opportunity for me. I'm really thrilled to be back in Ann Arbor after 40 years. And it's a great opportunity, frankly, to reflect on whatever relevance history has to my so-called career, including engagement in public policy. Nearly 40 years ago, soon after completing my second dissertation topic, I made my second transition out of academia. That had been a year at the Harvard School of Public Health trying to combine public policy and history into the real world of working in healthcare finance. And this was followed by 3 other major career changes as depicted on this slide. I guess I was talking to Jim Garrison this morning. He said about 25% of history PhDs never practice in academia. So I'm 1/4 of this panel. I think I'm probably representative then. And so this talk may be for the 25% of you graduate students who fall into that category. There should be a sound button here, but there isn't. Okay. Well, you won't get to hear that sound. So I spent most of my life outside of academia. The real world experience I had was with 2 nonprofit health plans when I left Harvard School of Public Health. And in preparing for this talk, I wasn't sure what image would come to your mind when I said health insurance executive. So I went to Bernie Sanders' website and found a portrait of a health insurance executive. That's the first one there. After that, after sort of mastering the dark crafts of health insurance, I went into the light and led the charge on what you might know as Obamacare, what in Massachusetts is simply referred to as healthcare reform, and what was the model for the Affordable Care Act. In part because Ted Kennedy and some of the people on his staff who came from Massachusetts really shaped it in the Senate, and in part because it was done here in the United States. It's absolutely amazing. With 50 different models of universal health insurance in the world, the only ones that people in DC cared about was, oh, you actually did that in Massachusetts, in the United States? How did you do this? How did you do that? How did you do the next? So we really were the model. And I had kind of a major role in the sense that I led an organization that was tasked to implement it. And our legislature, in its wisdom, while it voted 198-2, almost all Democrats for it, it was led by a Republican governor, it was financed by a Republican Secretary of Health in Washington. They actually delegated most of the tough decisions to this agency that I was hired to start and run. Anyway, that was kind of a fun run. Eventually I tried the overstep the patience of the next governor I worked for, Deval Patrick. And in 2011, I went to work working with about a dozen states, CMS, federal Medicare, Medicaid services, and a couple of private state clients trying to implement the Affordable Care Act. So that's me in the third picture dressed as a modern-day Sisyphus. And then finally, having exhausted all honest ways of making a living, I semi-retired back into academia, my third attempt, I guess. So far it's stuck. That's me, along with Rube Goldberg, trying to diagram out the American healthcare system for my students. Having bridged further afield, probably than anybody that you'll even hear from today, certainly on this panel, I'm guessing that what might be of interest is how did I move from history to journalism, health insurance, public health, etc. And how does history relate to any of that? The answer to the first question is in the title of the talk, Sliding Doors. And I'll elaborate on that in a few minutes, but quickly to illustrate the point, I can tell you that my first effort in historical research, it was actually the product of my first semester research seminar, is that what you call them here? was a piece that eventually was published in something called the American Quarterly. I don't know if the professionals here, okay, yeah, good. You know that. I've never read it since leaving here. I landed this job as a journalist in DC on the strength of that article. The guy, the bureau chief, kind of liked it. It was interesting. It was on saloons and hobos and working class culture, and it tickled his fancy. Anyway, as I searched in mid-1970s in DC for the feature stories that they had hired me to write, even though I had never, ever written so much as one sentence as a journalist, politicians then were running around like chickens with their heads cut off, screaming, "Oh my God, healthcare costs 8% of GDP and it's going up, this is unsustainable." Clearly at 18% of GDP, we now know they were wrong. So I wrote a couple of stories about cost containment, and then that moved me on to something called the President's Council on Wage and Price Stability, which no longer exists. And I wrote some case studies, and that's what made me what passes for in DC as an expert on cost containment. Believe me, it's a low bar. The storytelling that I began to practice as a graduate student eventually led me through journalism to health policy. Interestingly, health policy led me back to history, specifically to research and write a doctoral thesis on how 19th century charity hospitals, and that's what hospitals were in the 19th century, had developed into competing firms sitting atop the medical-industrial complex of the 20th century. And this was quite far afield from my original dissertation topic on the social history of the army of migrant laborers who built our railroads, harvested our crops, destroyed our forests, and mined precious minerals. I'll get to this in a minute. What I began to learn from reading and writing history, and I kind of picked it up on my own, I have to be honest with you, nobody had taught me, and what I wish I had learned more about as a graduate student is the power of narrative inquiry. The Greek word historia means knowledge through inquiry. In Middle English, it came to mean simply story. And I'm told that in several modern European languages, and you can probably correct me, there's a single word in each of those languages that means both story and history. We fledgling social and economic historians in Ann Arbor, when I was here, were somewhat envious of the quantitative social sciences, and only later did I come to appreciate the power of narrative. It's narrative, not numbers. That's how we relate to each other. Those of us, people who have been written out of history, know far better than anybody else just how we understand ourselves through history. I think Faulkner said it best: the past is never dead, it isn't even past. Consider, for example, the emotional resonance of this ineloquently phrased history lesson, summed up in the four-letter word on the hat that excites Donald Trump's base. However biased, there is an entire narrative of America's past which this cap rests upon. And I imagine it is equally, if oppositely, arousing of emotion on your part. So, similarly, in a more constructive and I hope more benign way, when we tried to convince the Bay State's uninsured to enroll in health insurance and a larger Massachusetts public to support health reform, including the odious individual mandate, we led with stories, personal histories to be precise. As one politician advised me literally a couple of days before I took this job, John, this is a campaign. From start to finish, it's a campaign. We had lots of data with which to wage this campaign, and we used some of it, but that is not the primary way we communicated with voters, nor with people we had to move to action, to sign up for something as complex as a 12-month forward-looking financial contract known as health insurance. And just to give you a little context about when I say communicate with voters, every decision we had was immediately criticized by right-wing radio as far away as California. So we were in a bit of a battle. One of those stories is Jacqueline's. Jacqueline had a lump in her breast, which she tried to ignore when she was uninsured. She got coverage through our health reform. She got it checked out. She's alive today as a result. That, much more than the statistics, is what moved people. And speaking of stories, I do believe that those which represent deep inquiry and bear some resemblance to the truth, so forget the former slide, are the most powerful. Why else would Schindler's List, The Green Book, Saving Private Ryan, you can name them on and on and on, end by scrolling through the epilogue to the story that you've just witnessed on the big screen, if not to reinforce its connection with history. By the way, we also use the best-known brand in New England on the right. Here are two ways of depicting healthcare and the shortcomings of our healthcare system. On your left is a classic two-dimensional line graph connecting the plot for each country of life expectancy, that's on the y-axis, with dollars per capita spent on medical care, that's on the x-axis. It's actually one of my favorite slides. I do now teach, and even just giving talks. It's one of my favorite slides because it offers a couple of interesting observations. One is that while under $2,000, there seems to be some correlation between spending on longevity. Once you hit about $2,000, you hit the point of diminishing, in fact, zero returns. You can spend a lot more, and basically all those dots are a horizontal line. The other, of course, is the position of the United States to the far left, showing how much we spend per capita, and actually our longevity ain't very good, suggesting potentially even negative returns on investment. That's probably an overreading of the slide, but I like to make the point. On the right, by contrast, is the way my students and most Americans think about our healthcare financing. A Rube Goldberg contraption of monumental complexity producing virtually nothing. Well, I shouldn't say it, producing little. After laboring to master healthcare financing, my students inevitably come to me in exasperation asking, why is our coverage schemes so convoluted? And the answer is in history. It is impossible to understand how we got and why we got to where we are without peeling back the historical layers that gradually shaped our healthcare non-system over the past 90 years. A peculiarly American history that begins in the 1930s with two important acts. One is FDR's decision not to include health insurance in the Social Security Acts of 1935, under a lot of pressure from the American Medical Association. And two, the American Hospital Association's effort to shore up sagging market revenues during the Great Depression. Hospitals did so by inventing Blue Cross, a private prepayment scheme, and promoting it in every state of the Union. Unlike most European countries, where national governments sponsored a national public health insurance first, in America, it was the medical providers who devised and nationally promoted private health insurance. Having grown addicted to the flow of patient revenues in the 1920s, when the stream began to dry up in the 1930s, these formerly charitable institutions sponsored voluntary private prepayment plans. Hospitals sponsored Blue Cross, their surgeons sponsored Blue Shield. Subsequently, in Europe and Canada, entrepreneurs developed little private insurance schemes, sort of around the dominant national public coverage programs. By contrast, here, Washington began in the 1960s with Medicare and Medicaid, a series of efforts to patch the holes and the cracks in our private system in such a way as to be very careful not to disturb private employer-sponsored insurance. That's why we have such a convoluted system, and it's impossible to understand it by looking at a series of dots and graphs on a cross-national comparison. We can only begin to make sense of the convoluted healthcare financing, the most convoluted scheme on God's green earth, by understanding its history. As I have written recently, we are also most likely to fundamentally remake it, our healthcare system, by strategically engaging the same forces that have shaped it historically. This is not, by the way, the approach that Bernie and Elizabeth are promoting, but that's a long digression for another time. Okay, a little career advice. I have been asked in conclusion to offer some career advice as a job for which I am totally unqualified, but as you can tell from my brief synopsis of my career history, that's never stopped me. First, I'd like to offer a simple admonition, and that's to enjoy Ann Arbor. And I want to see if I can illustrate the title of my talk and my main piece of advice by getting this clip to play. And as usual, technology fails me. There should be a button here or an arrow. Oh, all right. That's a good reason not to get it to work. So what you don't see here is a clip from a lovely movie called Sliding Doors, in which Gwyneth Paltrow just misses the tube, and or she just makes the tube to work. And in one scenario, and these two plots twist throughout the movie like DNA, she comes home and finds her boyfriend shagging another woman, and in the other plot, she supports her would-be novelist boyfriend through waitressing, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it all turns on whether you make this, this little door. And the theme is that when one door closes, and for, on average, I guess about 25% of history PhDs these days, the professional door to tenure track will not open. The key is to be prepared to walk through another door. The Israeli historian, philosopher Yuval Noah Harari suggests in his most recent book that your generation faces continual obsolescence. You know, think Andrew Young's driverless trucks, AI-powered surgery, radiology, accounting, etc. And the only thing, the best way to prepare is through broad skills rather than narrow expertise. And I can think of no skill more broadly applicable than doing history in both the Greek sense of deep inquiry and the Middle English sense of narrative. I hope you do better here in Ann Arbor than I did in learning to tell stories. I urge you to acquire and hone this highly valuable skill. Through stories, you can do anything better, and there are a bunch of things you can't do without stories. I actually think this is advice, since you were talking, Jay, about how the department's adapting. Nobody here ever taught me to write, let alone craft stories. That's what history actually is, despite our envy of the quantitative sciences. So I urge you to acquire that skill. I can only offer a couple of cliches by way of wrapping up. Network like crazy. For introverts like me, this is not comfortable, but that's how the world works. I give you by way of example, I have had 7 career changes, not job changes, career changes in my life, you know, like academia to journalism, journalism to government work, etc. And all but one of them was done by personal contacts, not by applying for an open position. Also, I can suggest that you get out of academia if you possibly can. It's a real-world experience. I know that Jay mentioned opening up the venue of internships beyond, I presume, teaching assistant. That led me to the Kellogg Foundation and to NIH, where they gave me, among one of the advantages, they gave me $24,000 over 15 months to support my dissertation research at a time when the most ambitious, prestigious option on campus was a $3,600 Rackham Fellowship. So There's some obvious tangible benefits. More importantly, it convinced me that I need not pursue a career in academia for which I was not particularly well suited. So even if you plan to climb the tenure track ladder, I think you'll do far better if you take a peek over the ivy-covered walls. Thank you for the inviting me.